welcome to the NKS Classics channel. My name is Molly and I am here with
Harry.
Jessica.
This presentation is the first in a series we intend to produce discussing and analysing the res gestae de Y Augusti. We are undertaking this project primarily as a source of reinforcement of understanding and subsequent revision for our study of Augustus and the foundation of the Principate. This presentation will cover chapters 1 to 3 and the script we use will be in the down bar.
So what were your first impressions on reading the opening chapters of the res gestae?
Well, I was particularly struck by the overuse of the first person singular, which is used 10 times in one form or another within the first 4 sentences of the res gestae. I did get the impression that Augustus was a guy who might have been a little bit full of himself, though it could be interpreted as someone who is highly confident of the things he claims to have achieved. What the res gestae appears to portray is how Augustus as a person, as opposed to a ruler, wished to be perceived by future generations. Of course, the details are inextricably linked to how people will judge his success as a ruler. If we read the res gestae as a standalone source, Augustus comes across as almost too good to be true, with the Senate seemingly awarding him everything that he wants.
Well, we have here a man whose apparent sole intention was to avenge the death of his adopted uncle, Julius Caesar, and make sure everything he had decreed remained in place. And he started this personal agenda by prosecuting Brutus and Cassius for murder. He starts chapter 1 of the res gestae by stating, "I mustered an army at my personal decision and at my personal expense, and with it I liberated the state, which had been oppressed by a despotic faction." The way I understand it is that the despotic faction had actually been granted an amnesty by the Senate, who presumably were hoping things would settle down following Caesar's assassination and Rome would see an end to one-man rule. Octavian was not the only player with an agenda though. Mark Antony wanted control of Cisalpine Gaul, a province promised to Brutus by Caesar, and he more than likely used underhand tactics in persuading the Senate to order the handover.
Well, with Octavian taking Caesar's name, he also gained the loyalty of Caesar's troops, so Cicero sided with Octavian. For now, seeing him as the best way of eliminating Antony, who was besieging Brutus a mutiner, and probably seeing victory and subsequent control of Italian Gaul as a way of regaining a foothold in Rome's power structure. Antony was definitely the more astute militarily, so Octavian must have had genuine fear for his life after the assassins he hired to kill Antony failed in their mission. It's a little wonder that he frantically recruited as many veterans as he could. At the age of 19 and with no real military experience, he must have thought his days were numbered. Yes, he did make a personal decision to raise an army, but I think the immediate urgency was self-preservation rather than liberation of the state. He doesn't mention that in chapter 1.
Both Cicero and Mark Antony were powerful men in Roman politics. Does anyone think either of them really had Rome's interest at heart?
Well, can we ever really know that for sure? Cicero, as the mouthpiece for the Senate, would appear to have the more genuine interest, though one would suspect that interest would never harm him socially or financially. As for Antony, it is difficult to tell. His consulship certainly gave him the necessary political experience, and he was a successful military leader who had the respect of his legions, so in that sense he ticked all the boxes for an ideal candidate. The reading of Caesar's will effectively dictated that any ambitions he had to succeed as ruler were virtually squashed, as Octavian's decision to take Caesar's name and operate in the name of Caesar, as it were, was going to form a formidable barrier to any progression. Going against Octavian would now be seen as an affront to Caesar. Under different circumstances, I think Antony would have made a good provincial governor, but with no loyalty to Octavian, and he was probably astute enough to realise that second best was the best he could realistically hope for. He certainly wasn't going to settle for anything less than a lucrative province, and it seems unlikely it would have all found its way into the treasury.
Quite early on in Suetonius, we are told that when Antony was consul and Octavian was a patrician applying for a tribuneship of the people, Antony opposed this action, probably to keep Octavian in check, and denied Octavian his ordinary legal rights, which were only reinstated on the payment of a heavy bribe. So there is definitely a conflict between what Antony considered politically prudent and how much he could manipulate the system for his own financial gain. But surely we must paint Octavian with the same brush. Chapter 1 depicts him as the saviour of the state, but he must have realised the enormous personal wealth and prestige that was up for grabs if he could somehow emulate Julius Caesar's position.
So is chapter 1 factually correct?
Yes, so it's just still economic with the truth. We have discussed that Octavian acted illegally against Antony in 44 BC but this is not mentioned in the Res Gestae. Then he formed an alliance with Antony and Lepidus in order to defeat Brutus, another fact not mentioned. Right at the beginning, there is an overuse of the first person. I guess that using the first person plural rather than a singular when detailing responsibilities for past achievements would detract from Augustus as the person. He didn't want to be remembered as someone who needed the assistance of others.
When Octavian joined forces with consuls Hirtius and Pansa, both of them were killed in battle. This is stated in the Res Gestae, though the significance is played down a bit by simply mentioning it in a subordinate clause of a sentence focused on the people subsequently appointing Octavian as consul and triumvirate. Suetonius suggests that Octavian may have played a part in their deaths, even suggesting that he dispatched Hirtius with his own hand in the confusion of battle, with the intent of taking command of both of their armies. Of course, we don't know whether this is true or not, and it's not something he's going to admit, but it does throw serious questions over the validity of his rise to power, even though the Res Gestae is technically correct on this issue.
Chapter 2 is very brief. Those who killed my father I drove into exile by way of the courts of law, exacting retribution for their crime, and afterwards I defeated them twice in battle while they were making war upon the state.
Well, this refers to the two battles at Philippi after Octavian had joined forces with Antony and Lepidus, forming the second triumvirate, and the first was a little more tricky for Augustus than the Res Gestae would have us believe. Octavian's forces engaged with those of Brutus, while Antony's engaged with those of Cassius. Suetonius tells us that Octavian was in ill health at the time and was driven out of his camp by the enemy, but managed to escape with some difficulty to Antony's command. The battle between Octavian and Brutus ended with no clear victory for either side, but Antony had overcome Cassius's army with a decisive victory. Cassius committed suicide, leaving his remaining troops under the command of Brutus. A major factor in Octavian's final victory, not mentioned or alluded to in the Res Gestae, is that Brutus had less military experience than Crassus and was therefore unable to command the respect of the troops who were eventually defeated. Had Crassus survived to lead the armies, the outcome may have been different.
To paraphrase chapter 3, Augustus involved himself in lots of wars across the whole world and spared the lives of those who asked for mercy, preferring to preserve than to destroy. Many soldiers pledged their allegiance to him, and he gave them land and money.
It is important to remember that the whole world to Octavian was significantly smaller than the whole world we know, and while most of his foreign battles were conducted by his legates, he only commanded armies in 2 foreign wars, detailed by Suetonius in Augustus 20. Nevertheless, his self-portrayal as Octavian the Merciful would appear to be somewhat wide of the mark. Suetonius again tells us that following the second and decisive battle of Philippi, Octavian showed no clemency to his enemies. While Antony allegedly showed respect for the body of Brutus, Octavian ordered his head to be severed and had it sent back to Rome for throwing at the feet of Caesar's statue. Suetonius further states that Octavian refused on more than one on the more distinguished condemned prisoners the right to a decent burial, then made a father and a son, who had pleaded for their lives, draw lots to see who would die. The fact that the father was executed and the son then committed suicide is largely irrelevant to this discussion, but Suetonius' simple sentence, "he watched them both die," tells us much about the character of Octavian.
Oh, Suetonius is to be believed. It must have really riled Octavian that when the remaining prisoners were led away, disgusted by Octavian's behaviour, they saluted Antony as imperator while hurling abuse at Octavian.
Well, I wonder whether who was selected for clemency was selected based on the impact it would have on Octavian. Antony's wife Fulvia and brother Lucius Antonius gathered a few legions to fight Octavian in support of Antony, who they thought should be sole ruler of Rome. After Octavian besieged them at their retreat of Perusia, he spared the pair of them, sending Lucius to govern a province in Spain and sending Fulvia into exile. He must have been aware that history would not look favourably on their execution, particularly since they had been defeated. However, many of Perusia's inhabitants were then butchered without mercy for their support of Octavian's enemies, allegedly offering 300 prisoners of equestrian or senatorial rank as human sacrifices at the altar of Caesar. Those who begged for pardon or attempted to offer credible mitigating circumstances relating to their charges were simply told by Octavian, "You must die." I suspect that these were largely people whose names would not feature in the records of history. They would soon be forgotten, and their executions were unlikely to incur any retaliation. Octavian needed their estates to pay off his veterans, and mass slaughter was a quick and effective way of achieving this.
I think the most significant omission from the res gestae is his role in the prescriptions. Although we are told he opposed them at first, once he got them underway, he carried it out more ruthlessly than his colleagues in the triumvirate, who often relented under pressure of political influence or buckled under the victim's pleas for pity. Octavian declared that no one should be spared and even added the name of his guardian to the list. Then, when Lepidus justified the prescriptions before the Senate and declared them to be over, Octavian asserted that he would only consent to close the list, provided he would be allowed a free hand in the future.
Well, the res gestae certainly raises many points for discussion and analysis. From the short section we've looked at so far, how do you rate this as a historical source?
I do think it provides us with invaluable information, but we must look at it in context. It is not an autobiography, but a list of achievements, albeit a highly biased one. One only has to look at the title to understand this is not going to read like the achievements of an ordinary man. Divi Augusti means the divine Augustus. This is meant to read like the achievements of a god, and it does. It seems all his actions are perfect, he never encountered any problems in undertaking them, and any opposition was merely swept aside.
I think it provides us with a good starting point for each event he mentions. It seems, so far at least, that everything he states happened did happen, but we then need to cross-reference these events with the accounts of others in order to gain a better understanding of both Augustus the man and Augustus the ruler. We have looked mainly at the accounts of Suetonius, who was writing from a completely different perspective than Augustus. Suetonius writes a biographical account, and it's much easier to write about someone else's flaws and shortcomings than to write about your own. Much of Suetonius' work is based on rumour and hearsay, so again, we have to treat it with a degree of caution, but I still think that reading the Res Gestae and the 12 Caesars together helps us to build a fairly clear idea of the overall picture, even if some of the finer details are open to question.
So from what we've looked at so far, what are our early impressions of Augustus?
I'd say a man on a mission. He knew what he wanted and he did what needed to be done to get it.
He virtually sets himself up as the most arrogant man to have ever walked the earth, and he's at least the most arrogant person I've ever read about in classics.
I'm looking forward to reading about the other aspects of Octavian's rule. I think we are dealing with an extremely intelligent man, even though some of his qualities might be a little flawed.
So, that's it for today. This has been the NKS Classics YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe.
And like. Bye.
Bye.